There are so many tragedies wrapped into this overall catastrophe, the catastrophe, of course, being unleashed against the people of Gaza by Israel, that it is difficult to know where to start. But here's one, and it's been nagging at me. It's the absolute crushing certainty that not only will this human catastrophe kill so many innocent people, and maim and traumatise so many more, but that it will fail on its own terms. How do we know this? Well, for a start, history. Now, history is not a perfect guide, but it is the only real guide that we have. The tragedy about the cliche, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, is that it's obviously been said enough to achieve cliche status without its actual lesson being absorbed. Now, this week, I was on television with Liam Fox, a Conservative MP, who backs every single catastrophic military intervention and indeed was Defence Secretary during the war in Libya. Let's hear me put that to him.
Look, I have to say this, Lou. Let's just be brutally honest. People like yourself brought us Afghanistan. You said anyone who criticised the occupation that went on for 2 decades were Taliban stooges, and we ended up with the Taliban stronger than ever. The same with Iraq. We were told we were stooges of Saddam Hussein. We had the blood and chaos and hundreds of thousands of people and Islamist extremism on the rampage. You gave us Libya, we got a failed state.
Are you going to say anything about Gaza? Or are we just going to get this teenage hysterical rant?
It's not teenage hysteria to use historical precedent to point out that every single time we have been told these military onslaughts are necessary, they end in a greater catastrophe.
And there's
no basis for counterinsurgency programmes succeeding in this way.
No substance whatsoever,
there is
which is exactly what we'd expect.
Well, you don't like your record being obviously discussed because you know it's going to be the same
because
with Hamas.
I'm really sorry, and I know that you two have got so much to say to each other. Maybe you can go and have a drink after the programme and fight it out in the pub.
Don't drink during the week.
You probably spot there how he got personal rather than address the actual substance of what I was saying. Now, to quote the idol of Liam Fox, Margaret Thatcher, I always cheer up immensely if one is particularly wounding, an argument that is, because I think, well, if they attack one personally, it means they have not a single political argument left. That's why my father always taught me, never worry about anyone attacks you personally. It means that arguments carry no weight and they know it. Right, Liam? Don't get used to me approvingly quoting Margaret Thatcher, by the way. Where are the lies in terms of what I said, though? Where's the dishonesty in terms of what I said? Shall we deal with Afghanistan first? The history, of course, of the West there was backing the Mujahideen in the 1980s against the Soviets. Didn't exactly pan out that well, which has a parallel, given Israel intentionally boosted Hamas. Benjamin Netanyahu did so, as Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, put it. He was quoted as saying that you should support them and give funds to them, and that will stop a viable Palestinian state ever being possible. Now, our Saudi allies allowed their wealthy citizens to fund the Taliban when it was in power. As the author and Afghanistan expert Anand Gopal put it to me back in 2021, the Taliban all but evaporated in 2001. Now, there's a difference with Hamas now because there was no chance of Hamas simply evaporating in the way that the Taliban did. But you see what happened next. Afghan politicians and the new government exploited a US desire to eliminate so-called bad guys by falsely claiming their supporters were Taliban, their opponents were Taliban supporters. Massacres, mass arrests, house raids and torture ensued. Pro-government forces recruited kids even as soldiers, where the Afghan local police murdered civilians, engaged in theft, kidnapping and just various atrocities. Now, the CIA-backed Coast Protection Force oversaw similar human rights abuses. Their victims ranged from 14-year-old boys to 60-year-old tribal elders. As Human Rights put it, a central myth was that Afghan strongmen, warlords and commanders the US chose as allies to oust the Taliban could help to provide security and stability despite their records of abuses. And again, they committed numerous atrocities against civilians. And you had Afghan detention centres packed with prisoners who were beaten, suffocated and subjected to electric shocks. And according to the International Criminal Court, the US Armed Forces and CIA may have committed war crimes by torturing detainees. The Afghan expert Gopal tells me there are dozens of Abu Ghraibs in Afghanistan that went unreported. Airstrikes killed thousands of civilians and were followed by what Human Rights Watch described as poor investigations and infrequent condolence payments. According to the UN data, in the last 5 years of Western involvement in Afghanistan, 40% of all civilian casualties from airstrikes were children. Sounds familiar, that, doesn't it? Between 2017 and 2020, the civilian death toll from Western bombs surged by more than 300%. So the atrocities committed by the West and its allies were instrumental in reviving the fortunes of the Taliban. So was mass corruption, etc. But the point is these atrocities committed by the West helped drive people into the arms of a political movement that actually was completely on its knees in 2001, unlike Hamas. What about Iraq? Now, people, I think, are more commonly familiar with the catastrophe, well, certainly earlier on. The invasion, of course, based on a false pretext. I remember when I was at Oxford before the invasion, the general coming in and saying that 99% of the Iraqi population would be celebrating and throwing flowers at troops. The other 1% would be too scared to come out, but soon would join in the celebrations. Didn't exactly pan out like that, from what I recall. Now, when the US went in, they massacred innocent people at, for example, Fallujah, a very important city in Iraq, mostly of Sunni Iraqi citizenship. The consequence of those early massacres, well, that drove people into the arms of insurgents. Fallujah became a citadel of insurgents against the US occupation. You see, you slaughter people, what you do is you leave behind people who aren't just grief-stricken, but angry. And that's what happened in Fallujah. It was a microcosm. And in 2004, the US engaged in horrible destruction of that city and indeed used white phosphorus against civilian populations, which, again, Israel are accused of doing today. There was the dismissal of the Iraqi army. Suddenly lots of people without guns were angry and driven into the arms of insurgents. We were told Al-Qaeda's attack on the Twin Towers was the basis for the Iraqi invasion, but they had almost no presence in Iraq before that invasion. Now Iraq became their playground. A brutal counterinsurgency program in the 2000s ensued. That was seen as successful. Al-Qaeda was defeated. Surely you couldn't get anything worse than Al-Qaeda. Oopsie daisy, a failure of imagination. Now, as my friend Mehdi Hassan, the brilliant journalist, puts it, the shootings, the torture, the general chaos all helped drive thousands of Iraqis from the minority Sunni community into the arms of radical groups led by brutal gangsters such as al-Zarqawi. And he was the ringleader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which ended up as the precursor to ISIS. Mass incarceration, tens of thousands of Iraqis horribly treated. That was also crucial in terms of radicalization. Now, I mean, it should be pointed out that they drew their support from the minority Sunni population in Iraq. But we're talking here about the vast majority of the Palestinians, obviously almost all Palestinians in Gaza, viscerally, bitterly opposed to Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people. Hamas is more embedded in the local population than either Taliban or Al-Qaeda, because the secular movements which embraced peace were brutally undermined by Israel. They end up with nothing to show for abandoning the armed struggle. It's a political idea. You can't just wipe out some Hamas cadre and hey presto, it vanishes. It remains in existence as an idea. We saw in Iraq and Afghanistan how the brutality laid the foundations for what came next. And actually the brutality, the concentration of brutality is much worse in Gaza than it was in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not to belittle the terrible crimes committed by the West in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but they're much bigger countries with much bigger populations than the 2.2 million or so in Gaza, who are facing concentrated firepower in a very small area the size of East London. Now, these people responsible, the architects of these catastrophes, walk from crime scene to crime scene, drenched in blood, demanding yet more blood, acting as though they haven't been completely discredited by the catastrophes they cheered on and indeed were responsible for, which claim millions of lives, according to a study by Brown University into the post-9/11 wars, and indeed as well so many UK and US service personnel. So with this counterinsurgency programme, the prospects are even less favourable. There's the context of decades of Palestinians driven from their homes, being occupied, besieged, their land stolen and settled on, the apartheid diagnosed by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and the Israeli human rights organisation B'Tselem, their people being massacred by the Israeli army and the settlers for so many years. The brutality here, as I said, is even worse. You will end up with a grief-stricken, oppressed people with absolutely nothing to lose whatsoever. How do you think that's going to pan out? Just realistically, just use your basic common sense and look at the precedents. I also mentioned Libya, of course. Every single military intervention this lot have given us has been a catastrophe, but Iraq and Afghanistan are particularly pertinent. You think, what else will be created here? Think about it. What will be created other than a land where all the people have been brutalised, they've lost loved ones? Do you really think they'll accept being even more persecuted and oppressed, and they'll embrace Israel, particularly given Israel is talking of a permanent occupation of Gaza? Under a far-right government in Israel, stuffed full of people who do not think that Palestinians are humans and are open about wanting to kill and oppress and steal their land. It's obvious how this ends, not just in bloodshed, but with Palestinians driven ever further into the arms of quote-unquote extremism. I'll put my reputation on the line. This is going to be a catastrophe, just as all these other monstrous, horrible interventions were catastrophes. We let them get away with it those other times. And I really do think we have to learn. We can't let them keep getting away with this. Please like, subscribe, do support us on patreon.com/OJS84 to keep the show on the road. I'll speak to you soon.